Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Newseum's Night Conference Center. I'm Jim Duff. I'm CEO here at the Newseum, and it is my great privilege tonight to welcome you and over 300 of our very special Newseum members, donors, and guests to this special evening. It's because of you and your support that we're able to host engaging programs with historic figures like tonight's civil rights hero, Congressman John Lewis. I would also like to recognize and thank Walmart as a contributing sponsor for our Civil Rights at 50 exhibit and programming. We're very proud of the new exhibit, and I hope you'll all get a chance to visit and see it. It's going to be a permanent exhibit here, and we are memorializing some of the remarkable work of John Lewis in that exhibit, as well as many other brave men and women who made great sacrifices to get us to where we are today. Progress, we're not done yet, but great progress, and I know the Congressman feels this way about it as well. We all know of the life and legacy of Congressman Lewis. He's represented Georgia's 5th Congressional District since 1987. He is an American icon, and he's a pioneer of the civil rights movement. He became a leader of the student sit-in movement at age 20 and was one of the original Freedom Riders. He led the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee during the height of its influence. He spoke at the March on Washington, and he led the Bloody Sunday March in Selma, Alabama. I would say, on a personal note, one of the greatest thrills of my life was to attend the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington here in Washington just a couple of weeks ago, and to hear Congressman Lewis speak again at the Lincoln Memorial. I want to thank also, on a personal note, Connie Newman, who made that possible for me. It was a great privilege. The Congressman's story is documented in detail in our new civil rights exhibit, Make Some Noise. And the title of that exhibit comes from the very words of the Congressman, who once said, "You've got to get out there and push and organize and agitate and stand up and make some noise." He said it more eloquently than I did, but those words mean so much to us here at the Newseum and at the Freedom Forum. They really embody what we stand for, and that's why it's such a very great privilege to have the Congressman with us tonight. You'll find that quote prominently displayed as you walk into our exhibit, which explores the new generation of student leaders in the early 1960s who fought segregation by making their voices heard and exercising their First Amendment rights. A companion 3-year changing exhibit will be updated each year to chronicle the milestones in the civil rights movement from 1963, 1964, and 1965. And as I mentioned, then it will ultimately become a permanent exhibit here at the Newseum. We all know of the Congressman's long and distinguished career, and now we can add a new line to his resume, and that is graphic novelist. The Congressman is co-author of the new graphic novel, March, which provides a vivid firsthand account of John Lewis's lifelong struggle for civil and human rights. The book is illustrated by Nate Powell, and the Congressman co-wrote the book with Andrew Aydin. And we're going to be hearing from Andrew also a little bit later tonight. Before I introduce the Congressman, we'd like to show you a brief clip of the film playing in our Make Some Noise exhibit, which chronicles the Congressman leading the 1965 march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. So if we could roll that video clip, we'll give you a brief look at that before we get started with the program and the Congressman.
Which side are you on, boy? Which side are you on, no, my lord?
You came down to make a mockery out of the courthouse. We're not going to have it.
While Sheriff Jim Clark bullied black citizens attempting to register to vote, John Lewis started a march to the State House, which ended violently at the foot of the Edmund Pettus Bridge.
This is an unlawful assembly. This march will not continue.
That's John Lewis at the front of the line in the white trench coat. For 5 years, he had faced brutal attacks fueled by faith in his cause. The nation watched and was moved to respond.
Oh, brothers, can you hear me? Oh, tell me if you can. Will you be an Uncle Tom, or will you be a man of my Lord?
Well, I mean, it was incredible because you saw the horses trampling over people. You actually saw John Lewis being knocked over. It was a very scary thing. I mean, it looked like state terrorism, which it was.
What happened in Selma is part of a far larger movement. Their cause must be our cause too. Because it's not just Negroes, but really it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome.
The Voting Rights Act was the final prize won through civil rights activism of students. By making some noise for change, those young people helped bring basic American freedoms to those who had been denied since the end of the Civil War.
Connie Newman and I were speaking upstairs just before the program, and we were both feeling so good about the fact that sometimes the good guys come out on top and are rewarded. And John Lewis is one of the good guys. He has stayed the course, and I think one of the reasons we think so highly of him to this very day, not only for what he did at the age of 20, but the fact that he stayed the course. He's been a public servant ever since. And that means a lot to a lot of people. And it's my great privilege to welcome and introduce Congressman John Lewis.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having us here. Thank you for the kind words of introduction. I'm delighted, very happy, and very pleased to be here. To be in this unbelievable place that is doing so much to tell the story of our struggle, the story of freedom, the First Amendment. It is good to be here. When you come here, you can never, ever forget. You learn, you study, you're inspired. I'm pleased to be here with my co-author, Andrew Aydin, this young man who came to me, he would tell you more about it, a few short years ago when he was much younger, and suggested that I should write a comic book. And he wouldn't give up. He wouldn't give in. He wouldn't take no for an answer. And he came back, and I sort of said, oh, well, I don't know. But came again. And I said, if you write it with me, we would do it. 5 years later, we have March Book 1, and there will be a Book 2 and a Book 3. I must tell you that I didn't grow up in a big city like Washington, D.C., or Atlanta, Georgia, or Birmingham, Alabama, or Buffalo, or Detroit, or Los Angeles, or Rockville, Maryland, or Silver Spring. I grew up on a farm in rural Alabama about 50 miles from Montgomery, outside of a little place called Troy. My father was a sharecropper, a tenant farmer. But back in 1944, when I was 4 years old, and I do remember when I was 4. How many of you remember when you was 4? What happened to the rest of us? In 1944, when I was only 4 years old, my father had saved $300. And with the $300, he bought 110 acres of land. We still own this land today. On this farm, we raise a lot of cotton and corn, peanuts, hogs, cows, and chickens. If any of you have the time and want to come up to Capitol Hill, since not too much is going on there these days, just come and visit the office. The moment you walk through the door, the first thing the staff will offer you will be some peanuts. Because I come from the state of Georgia, and the state of Georgia, like the state of Alabama, raised a lot of peanuts. And the Georgia Peanut Commission provided us with peanuts. Now, I don't eat too many of those peanuts. I ate so many peanuts when I was growing up in rural Alabama, I just don't want to see any more peanuts. Sometime I would get on a flight flying from Washington to Atlanta, or from Atlanta to Washington, and the flight attendant tried to give me some peanuts. So no, I don't care for any peanuts, it's okay. And since Atlanta is the home of the Coca-Cola Company, Coca-Cola provide all members of the Georgia congressional delegation with an adequate supply of Coca-Cola product, water, juice, and what else in juice? Coca-Cola, seltzer, soda. Every now and then I may have a Diet Coke. It's okay. Some of my staff people become so good, they learn to trade peanuts, Coca-Cola, for raisins with other staffers, M&M's, jelly beans, yeah. Well, any of you know anything about raising chickens? Well, on the farm, some of you know about Popeyes, Kentucky Fried, Church's, Bojinga, Chick-fil-A, yeah. But you don't know anything about raising chickens. Well, in book 1, March, I tell the story as a young child. It was my responsibility to care for the chickens. And I fell in love with raising chickens like no one else could raise chickens. I became very good at raising chickens. When the setting hen was set, I have to take the fresh eggs, mark them with a pencil, place them under the setting hen, and wait for 3 long weeks for the little chicks to hatch. Some of you are probably saying, now, John Lewis, why do you mark this fresh egg with a pencil before you place them under the setting hen? Well, from time to time, another hen would get on that same nest, and there would be some more eggs. And you had to be able to tell the fresh eggs from the eggs that were already under the setting hen. Do you follow me? You don't follow me. It's okay. It's all right. So when these little chicks would hatch, I would take these little chicks and give them to another hen. I put them in a box with a lantern, raise them on their own. Get some more fresh eggs and mark them with a pencil, place them under the setting hen, encourage the setting hen to stay on the nest for another 3 weeks. I kept on fooling these setting hens and cheating on these setting hens. And when I look back on it, it was not the right thing to do. It was not the moral thing to do. It was not the most loving thing to do. It was not the most nonviolent thing to do. It was not the most democratic thing to do. But I was never quite able to save $18.98 to order the most inexpensive incubator or hatcher from the Susan Roebuck store. Now, any of you here old enough to remember the Susan Roebuck catalog? You do? You really do? Don't fool me. Don't play with me. You remember that catalog? That big book? That thick book? That heavy book? Some people call it the ordering book. Other people call it the wish book. I wish I had this. I wish I had that. Well, as a little child, I kept on wishing. Just never able to save enough money to order that incubator. But as a little boy, about 8 or 9 years old, become very, very good at raising chickens. But I wanted to be a minister. I wanted to preach. So from time to time, with the help of my brothers and sisters and my cousins, we would gather all of our chickens together in the chicken yard, like you'll gather here in this hall. And my brothers and sisters and cousins would line the outside of the chicken yard, but they would help make up the audience, the congregation. And I would start speaking or preaching. And when I look back on it, some of these chickens would bow their heads. Some of these chickens would shake their heads. They never quite said amen. But I'm convinced that some of those chickens that I preached to in the 40s and the 50s tended to listen to me much better than some of my colleagues listen to me in the Congress. As a matter of fact, some of these chickens was just a little more productive. At least they produce eggs. Well, that's enough of that. That's enough of that. Book 1, March, Book 1, tell the story of me raising chickens and preaching to the chickens. And I think my first nonviolent protest, Andrew, I think I told you this, was against my mother and father in a very orderly, peaceful way, because they wanted to have a chicken for dinner. I raised these chickens. I gave them names. We had a little red hen we called Pullet. We had a white hen we called Belle. They were my friends. They were more than pets, but they taught me patience. They taught me hard work. They taught me a sense of stick-to-itness. I had to get up early in the morning before going off to school or going to the field to work to feed the chicken and provide water for them. But growing up there and we visit the little town of Troy, visit Montgomery, visit Tuskegee, I saw those signs that said white men, colored men, white women, colored women, white waiting, colored waiting. I would come home and ask my mother, my father, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, why? Why segregation? Why racial discrimination? And they would say, that's the way it is. Don't get in the way. Don't get in trouble. My mother always told me that I had a hard head. And I just said, why? I kept saying, why? I didn't like those signs. I didn't like segregation and racial discrimination. I didn't like getting up, riding on those broken down school buses that sometimes didn't make it to school. I didn't like seeing the hand-me-down books. I wanted to change things, but I didn't know what to do. But one day in 1955, 15 years old in the 10th grade, I heard about Rosa Parks. I heard the words of Martin Luther King Jr. on the old radio. And I was deeply inspired by the action of Rosa Parks, the words and leadership of Martin Luther King Jr. So inspired that in 1956, at the age of 16, with some of my brothers and sisters and cousins, we went down to the public library in the little town of Troy, Alabama, trying to get library cards, trying to check out some books. And we were told by the librarian that the libraries were whites only and not for coloreds. I didn't go back to that library, not the same building, but the Pike County Public Library in Troy, Alabama, until July 5th, 1998, by this time I'm in the Congress, for a book signing of my book, Walking with the Wind. And hundreds of blacks and white citizens showed up. Wonderful program. We had something to eat, something to drink. Signed a lot of books. End of the program, they gave me a library card. And Andrew would tell you that it was during those days, 57, when I finished high school. I'm going to try to make it short, Andrew, so you can talk some. I'm going to make it short. I'll bring it home. In 1957, when I was 17 years old, finished high school, I rode off to Troy State. It's not Troy University, to get an application. They didn't know that I was black. They sent me an application. The school is only 10 miles from my home. Fill out the application, send off my high school transcript. I never heard a word from the college. So I wrote a letter to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I didn't tell my mother, my father, any of my sisters or brothers, or any of my teachers. Dr. King wrote me back and sent me a round-trip Greyhound bus ticket and invited me to come to Montgomery to meet with him. In the meantime, I had been accepted at a little college in Nashville, Tennessee. So in September 1957, an uncle of mine gave me a $100 bill. Marge will tell you the whole story. More money than I ever had. And gave me a Foot Locker. Most of you know what a Foot Locker? One of these big trunks. I'm talking about the upright kind that you can pull or open, have the curtains and the drawers. I put everything that I own in that Foot Locker except those chickens. And went off to school to Nashville. And after being in Nashville for about 3 weeks, I told one of my teachers, a man by the name of Kelly Miller Smith, who was a minister in Nashville, but also a teacher at American Baptist College, that had been in contact with Dr. King. Kelly Miller Smith was born in Mount Bayou, Mississippi, attended Morehouse College, undergrad, came to Howard University Divinity School. Wonderful man, good friend of Dr. King. Great speaker, wonderful minister. He informed Dr. King that I was in Nashville. Martin Luther King Jr. got back in church with me and suggested when I was home for spring break to come and see him. So on a Saturday morning, my father drove me to the Greyhound bus station in March of 1958. By this time, I'm 18 years old. I boarded the bus, traveled 50 miles from Troy to Montgomery, and a young lawyer, never met or seen a lawyer before, a man by the name of Fred Gray, who was the lawyer for Rosa Parks and Dr. King and the Montgomery movement, and became our lawyer during the Freedom Ride in the march from Selma to Montgomery, and drove me to the First Baptist Church, pastored by the Reverend Ralph Abernathy, and ushered me into the pastor's study, the office of the church. And I saw Martin Luther King Jr. and Ralph Abernathy standing behind a desk. I was so scared, I didn't know what to say or what to do. And Dr. King spoke up and said, "Are you the boy from Troy? Are you John Lewis?" And I said, "Dr. King, I am John Robert Lewis." I gave my whole name. And that was the beginning of my involvement and my relationship with Martin Luther King Jr. I continued to study in Nashville. And it was in Nashville, Tennessee, that we met a young man by the name of Jim Lawson. And we tell his story and the story of the Nashville movement. Book 1 of Marge is drama, but Book 2 is going to be more drama, very dramatic. I first came to Washington, D.C. in 1961 to go on something called the Freedom Ride. 13 of us, 7 whites and 6 African Americans. Back in 1961, leaving Washington, D.C., black people and white people couldn't be seated together on a Greyhound bus or a Trailway bus. That is almost unbelievable. The same year that President Barack Obama was born. There was white waiting, colored waiting. We had to change that. It was very dangerous to test a decision of the United States Supreme Court. The first real incident occurred in Charlotte, North Carolina, when one of the young African-American men entered a so-called white waiting room. They had a so-called white barbershop and tried to get a shoe shine. He was arrested and taken to jail. The next day, he went before a judge, and the jury dismissed the charges. My seatmate, we traveled on from Charlotte to Rock Hill, South Carolina. We tried to enter a so-called white waiting room at a Greyhound bus station. We were attacked by a group of young men, beaten, and left lying in a pool of blood. The local police officials came up and wanted to know whether we wanted to press charges. We said no. We come with peace, with love. We come with nonviolence. Several years later, to be exact, in February 2009, almost a month after President Barack Obama had been inaugurated, One of the guys that had beaten me and my seatmate came with his son to my office on Capitol Hill and said, "Mr. Lewis, I'm one of the people that attacked you. I want to apologize. Will you forgive me?" I said, "Yes, I forgive you." His son started crying, he started crying, I started crying. They hugged me, and I hugged them. It says something about the power of nonviolence, the power of reconciliation. But the book continued to tell the story of the Freedom Ride, how it ended in Mississippi, how I went through Anderson with the burning of the bus, mob meeting us in Montgomery at the Greyhound bus station, where John Singerthaler was beaten. He was there representing President Kennedy and Robert Kennedy as a federal official. It was very dangerous to be a reporter then, to be a photographer, to be carrying a pad and a pen, or to be carrying cameras during those days. Most of the electronic people had those big cameras on their shoulders. We got off the bus in Montgomery. The first attacked members of the press, and then they turned on us. But the Freedom Ride led to the desegregation of public transportation all across the American South. And I said tonight that those signs that I saw when I was growing up, they're gone. They're gone and they will not return. The only places our children and their children will see those signs will be in a book, in a museum, or on a video. Our country is a different country. It's a better country. And we are a better people. So when someone said to me, nothing has changed, and we were said at the end of the book, in March, book 3, I was said, come and walk in my shoes. I want to thank you. I feel more than lucky, but I feel very blessed to grow up the way I grew up and have an opportunity to speak at the March on Washington on August 28, 1963, when I was only 23 years old, had all of my hair, a few pounds lighter, and to be ushered in to the Oval Office and President Kennedy standing in the door, shaking our hands, beaming like a proud father. He was so happy and so pleased that everything had gone so well. He kept saying to each one of us, "You did a good job, you did a good job." And when he got to Dr. King, he said, "And you had a dream." We all must continue to dream and make this little piece of real estate that we call America a little better for generation yet unborn. Thank you very much. This is Andrew Aydin.
Thank you.
No, thank you. Andrew, you're going to come in. You're going to introduce him?
I'll introduce him.
Okay.
Congressman
I'm getting
Lewis,
out of my
thank you.
place. Thank you.
Now you know, you've always known this, but now you know why we're particularly proud that Congressman Lewis helped us dedicate the Newseum here 5 years ago here on Pennsylvania Avenue in our opening. And he closed his remarks that wonderful day by saying, "I don't know where I would be today without the First Amendment." And as I just said a few minutes ago upstairs to a smaller group, John, I don't know where we would be today without you. We're so grateful for all you've done for our country, and it's just a great privilege to be associated with you here in this special building. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Andrew Aydin, who's the co-author of March, and he's going to explain a little bit more about the context of the book and the novel and their process of creating it. Andrew is an Atlanta native who serves in Congressman Lewis's D.C. office. He handles telecommunications, technology policy, as well as new media. Andrew, thank you.
Thank you. Well, you guys are getting to witness the hardest thing to do in Washington, which is follow John Lewis. Congressman Lewis has been my congressman since I was 3 years old. I grew up in Atlanta, and I grew up watching him on television. I grew up hearing him. I went to the King Center for the first time when I was 5, and if you had told me I would go back there when I was 30 for a book signing, I would have told you you're crazy. But this has been one of those journeys that was sort of guided by something the Congressman calls the spirit of history. To tell you a little bit about how we did this, or why we did this, I was serving as the Congressman's press secretary on his 2008 re-election campaign. And it was sort of coming to the end of the campaign, and people started talking about what they were going to do after it was over. And unashamed, I said I was going to a comic book convention. How many of you have been to a comic book convention? You're my guy. The rest of you have no idea what you're in for. But it's a wonderful place where maladjusted people who believe in something, we believe in something. We have a common language. And we get together and we talk about things that we read. And so I said this, I admitted this, and they started laughing, as you did. And Congressman said, no, don't laugh. There was a comic book during the movement, and it was incredibly influential. I didn't know about this comic book. It was called Martin Luther King and the Montgomery Story. It was published in December of 1957 by an organization called the Fellowship of Reconciliation. And as I learned about it, I was taken aback by this story of something that turns out to have inspired some of the earliest protests in the civil rights movement among young people. In Greensboro, Azelle Blair and Joseph McNeil read this comic book and decided that they too would have a boycott. And they went and they sat down on February 1st, 1960 at the Woolworths and became part of what they would forever be known as the Greensboro Four. And so as I sat there on that hot day in Atlanta, having the congressman defend me like that, I couldn't help but wonder, why don't you write a comic book? I learned all this, that the comic book had been used not just in the South, but it had been used in Latin America, distributed from Uruguay. It had been used in South Africa, distributed amongst the protesters of apartheid. It was used in Vietnam in the anti-war movement, and most recently it was used in Egypt in the days and weeks leading up to the revolution in Tahrir Square in 2011. I was captivated by the idea of a comic book that could inspire protest and civil disobedience all around the world. And so I couldn't stop myself. I asked him once, I said, John Lewis, why don't you write a comic book? And he said, I don't know about that. He looked at me like I was a little crazy. But I wouldn't stop, and I kept asking, why don't you write a comic book? You lived so many of these seminal moments of the movement that my generation has completely forgotten. We've forgotten the discipline of nonviolence. We've forgotten the philosophy. We've forgotten that it is a way to live your life, a better way, a way to change your society, a way to change your world. And so I kept asking, why don't you write a comic book? Until finally one day he turned around to me and he said, okay, let's do it. But only if you write it with me. In for a penny, in for a pound. I couldn't say no to that. And so we spent the next 5 years writing what you now know as March. In the end, we turned in a script that was a little bit longer than a comic book. When Nate Powell took a look at it, he said, this is not one book. And Nate is at home watching this, so I'm going to say hello to you, Nate. I hope you're having fun with Harper, and I wish you could be here. And he told me, no, this is going to be about 500 pages. We can't do it as one book. And so we huddled and we came up with the idea to do it as a trilogy. I'll tell you this. The characters in this story are real people. They didn't wear capes. They didn't have spandex outfits. But they were more heroes than anything I've ever seen in a comic book. They were fearless. Their cause was just. Their spirit was true. And so in doing this, I was terrified that I wouldn't be able to honor their memory, honor their legacy, honor their sacrifice. More importantly, do justice to what Congressman has worked so hard for. But I believe that what we've delivered, what we've created, is something that you will be able to use in schools, in libraries, to give your children, to give your grandchildren, your nieces and your nephews, something that will teach them a little bit about nonviolence, that will hopefully give them something that will help them look at the world in a new way, that will hopefully show them that they too can change the world. When I was on the pilgrimage with the congressman last spring, and I was coming down in the elevator, and I was there with Ethel Kennedy and John Siegenthaler, and I'm obviously starstruck to be in the elevator with them, and I sort of sheepishly said to Ethel Kennedy, you know, ma'am, you're in my graphic novel. She looked at me and said, that's nice, dear. But a few weeks ago, well, maybe a month now, when the early copies had come out, a reporter called me. And he said, I enjoyed your book, but I wanted to give it to my son. He's 9 years old, and I wanted to know what he thought of it. I wanted to know if it would work. Well, my son is marching around the house wearing a suit and demanding equality. It's funny, but let's put that in a different context. Imagine if we can take 9 and 10-year-olds, 11-year-olds and 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds and 14-year-olds. Imagine if we can take adults and we can teach them how you use nonviolence to make change in everyday society. We can teach them how you make the wrongs in the world right again. And to do it without firing a gun, without raising a fist, without harming anyone. So I say, John Lewis, thank you for writing a comic book with me, for walking this journey, for going to Comic-Con. That's my fault. But we have a chance here. It's not a book, it's not just a graphic novel, it's a chance to educate the next generation, to show them what they can do, to make this world a more peaceful and just place to live in. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Lewis. Thank you, Andrew. And thank all of you for being here this evening. We invite you to join us for a reception where the Congressman and Andrew will be happy to sign the graphic novel. Thank you.